I can't believe like it's been 9 years. Like I blinked an eye, and all of a sudden we're almost a decade away from this season in our life. But I was thinking through this and talking with professors that are still over there that are still very big in my life, and just talking through kind of the things that have changed in the 9 years. And if I think about it, there are lots of things in my life that has changed in 9 years. Like one of them is we made a major move in our life, moving over here. We relocated ourselves to Wyoming. I swore I was never going to live in Wyoming. Now, I don't necessarily ever want to leave, but Mike hears it. In 9 years, we've had 4 babies, and we have 4 beautiful, wonderful kids that are now a part of our lives. In 9 years, we have gone through transitions. We've gone through struggles. We've gone through pain and loss. In 9 years, I would have never thought that I would be in this place doing this, having this as my life, looking back 9 years ago. I wonder what has changed in your life in 9 years. Think back over the last 9 years for you. Like, did you expect everything in your life to land in the place that it has if you were to think about that 9 years ago? Did you expect things to turn out this way? Did you expect to be where you are right now? And I asked this question at Summit a couple weeks ago to college kids that are sitting there listening and kind of getting ready for ministry, and I asked them to respond to this question. Hey, think about 9 years ago. Did you think 9 years ago that you would be sitting at Summit Christian College getting trained for ministry or for missions work? And none of them raised their hand. It's amazing to think about what God can do in just a short amount of time in our lives and change the trajectory of our lives in just a short amount of time. Because the reality is we can have our expectations of how our life is going to go. We can have our plan in our mind of how things are going to play out in our life. But the reality is that it doesn't always go that way, does it? Life does not always go the way that we think or that we thought it was going to go. We were talking about this at Summit in the framework of faith. And they were spending time going through Hebrews chapter 11 and looking at some of the characters that you see in Hebrews chapter 11. And so I just want to share this with you from a couple weeks ago because it is really huge in my life right now. And so the framework for Hebrews chapter 11 is faith. The framework is looking at individuals that have been living out faith in their lives from the Old Testament, and the context comes from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 and 2. This kind of sets the tone for the entire chapter, doesn't it? Read this with me. Now faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. For our ancestors won God's approval by it. This morning I want to look at the lives of 2 individuals that we find in Hebrews chapter 11 and how they relate and apply to faith in our lives. And they are heroes who did not get a lot of attention. They are heroes that are easily glossed over or just read past as you're reading through this chapter. They are individuals, though, that especially in critical moments of their life had extreme faith in God that carried them through. So I want to look at 2 individuals with you this morning. The first one is this. The individual's name is Sarah. Let's look at the life of Sarah. Think about the life of Sarah. We know Sarah, right? Like we understand who she is fairly well. She was married to Abraham. She's an obvious looker, right, because of the encounters that she had with a king and a pharaoh. Like she was fairly attractive in nature. She seemed to live a life of loyalty to her husband, even in the midst of personal struggles. She, in several different times, had faith in someone greater than herself. But she is identified in Hebrews as one of great faith. Why? Well, because of her faith concerning the birth of her son. Because of her faith in God providing a son. This is not a quick story. We will move through this as fast as possible. I challenge you to keep up with us as we fly through this. We're going to start in Genesis chapter 11 and move through several chapters very quickly. It starts in Genesis chapter 12, with a promise given to Abram at the time, Abraham, formerly called Abram. Genesis chapter 12, verse 2, God says, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. At about 75 years old, Abraham is getting this promise to him, saying that God is going to promise to turn his name into a great nation, to multiply him, to expand his name, expand his family. Jump ahead a few chapters, Genesis chapter 15, starting in verse 2. But Abram said, Lord God, what can you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? Abraham continued, Look, you have given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house will be my heir. Now, the word of the Lord came to him. This one will not be your heir. Instead, the one who comes from your own body will be your heir. And he took him outside and said, Look at the sky and count the stars. If you are able to count them, then he said to him, your offspring will be as numerous. Again, God is confirming in this chapter, God is confirming to Abram that he will build a family line out of Abraham greater than the stars in the sky. And then we jump ahead to chapter 16, and we're not going to read this, but in its entirety, this chapter depicts this attempt of Sarah to take matters into her own hands, essentially, and control the situation and produce at least some form of offspring through Abraham. And so Sarah brings in her maid to Abraham and tells him to sleep with her, and the maid becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son, and this is where we get Ishmael. And this, of course, then makes the relationship between Sarah and her maid better, right? Like things just automatically become good. Yes, you can go ahead and laugh at that because you know the story. This totally ruins the relationship here in this household at this point. Things are so good that, in fact, the maid feels like she has to run off to the desert because she doesn't feel like she can even be around Sarah in that time anymore. And then we jump ahead to Genesis chapter 17. And God is making a covenant again with Abraham. And he changed it. This is where God changes his name from Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah. This is what it says, starting in verse 15. God said to Abraham, As for your wife Sarah, I do not call her Sarai, for Sarah will be her name. I will bless her, indeed. I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will produce nations. Kings of people will come from her. Abraham fell face down, and he laughed and said to himself, Can a child be born to a 100-year-old man? And can Sarah, a 90-year-old woman, give birth? So Abraham said to God, If only Ishmael were acceptable to you. But God said, No, your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac. And I will confirm my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his future offspring. And then we jump ahead a little bit more, next chapter, Genesis chapter 18, starting with verse 10. This is in the midst of Abraham and Sarah receiving some visitors at their place there, and this is what is said here, verse 10. The Lord said, I will certainly come back to you in about a year's time, and your wife Sarah will have a son. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent behind him, and Abraham and Sarah were old and getting on in years. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing, so she laughed to herself. After I have become shriveled up and my Lord is old, will I have this delight? But the Lord asked Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh, saying, Can I really have a baby when I'm old? Is anything impossible for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will come back to you, and in about a year she will have a son. And Sarah denied it. She said, I did not laugh, she said, because she was afraid. But he replied, the Lord replied, No, you did laugh. There's like a whole sermon there we can't get into at this point. But Sarah is old at this point. She is well beyond childbearing years. Logically, there are no babies happening at this point in their lives anymore. But again, the promise is still given to Abraham and to Sarah in this moment. And then we jump to Genesis chapter 21. And starting in verse 1, this takes place. The Lord came to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time God had told him. Abraham named his son who was born to him, the one Sarah bore to him, Isaac. And when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Can we just stop and appreciate what's going on here? 100 years old and you're having babies. I'm 31, Kimmy's 32. We are donezo. No more babies in our house. I cannot possibly oh my goodness. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. She also said, who would have told Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne a son for him in his old age. And in Hebrews chapter 11, we see Sarah make the list of heroes in the faith. This is what it says, chapter 11, starting in verse 11. By faith, even Sarah herself, when she was unable to have children, received power to conceive offspring, even though she was past the age, since she considered that the one who had promised was faithful. Therefore, from one man, in fact, from one as good as dead, came offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as immeasurable as the grains of sand by the seashore. Think about this. Think about Sarah here. By faith, even Sarah. By faith, even Sarah, who was too old to biologically have children anymore. By faith, even Sarah, who had tried unsuccessfully to take matters into her own hands to control the situation, causing more harm and more struggle on others. By faith, even Sarah, who questioned God's promises. By faith, even Sarah, who laughed at the thought of having children in front of God. By faith, even Sarah was able to have children. Why? In the midst of all that struggle, in the midst of all that back and forth with her, why was she able to have children? Because God was faithful in her life. Because she believed that he was faithful to the promise that he had given her. By faith, Sarah was able to have children. Let's look at individual number 2 this morning. Person number 2 goes by the name of Rahab. We don't know much necessarily about Rahab. She doesn't have a lot of passages about her throughout the Bible, but what we do know about her is that she is referenced in Hebrews chapter 11. She's also seen in the genealogies at the beginning of the New Testament. But what we know probably most about her is that even when she's referenced in the New Testament, she is referred to as, and you can kind of fill in what your translation says, but she is referred to as Rahab the harlot, Rahab the prostitute. She ultimately is a sex worker. She is a promiscuous woman. She is a lady of the night, however you want to say it, that's politically correct. And you know the story, right? You know her story. Joshua, in chapter 2, Joshua sends spies in to scout out the land, and they land at a town called Jericho. And in this moment, as they are scouting out what's taking place, this woman named Rahab, who is a harlot, who's a prostitute, takes them in and hides them from the officials of the town so that they're not found out and either sent out or killed for being there. And this really tests her in her life. Joshua chapter 2, starting in verse 8, let's read this. She goes and she visits the spies. This is after Rahab is confronted by the officials who are looking for these spies that are in their town. And they confront her and say, are you hiding these spies? And she says, no, I saw them leave town. And she says, if you hurry, you can find them. You can catch up to them. And they start running after these spies that apparently ran out of town, and they're on the run trying to find these spies that are ultimately right here on the roof, ultimately. So chapter 2, verse 8 says, before the spies lay down for the night, Rahab went up to the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard, this is important, we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sign. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. Our lives for your lives. And the men assured her, if you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. And then for several chapters, we don't hear from Rahab anymore. We don't hear about her until chapter 6. And chapter 6 of Joshua is the story, if you saw VeggieTales, you know, they go march around and milkshakes are flying, right? Nobody? Okay, that's fine. It's fine. Have kids, and then you can watch VeggieTales. So they go out and they march around, and there's this whole sequence of them just obeying how God wants them to take down Jericho, and the walls come falling down. And in chapter 6, starting in verse 22, this takes place. Joshua said to the two men who had scouted the land, these are the ones that interacted with Rahab, go to the prostitute's house and bring the woman out here and all who were with her, just as you promised her. So the young men who had scouted went in and brought out Rahab and her father, mother, brothers, and all who belonged to her. And they brought out her whole family and settled them outside the camp of Israel. They burned up the city and everything in it, and they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. However, Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute, her father's household, and all who belonged to her. Why? Because she hid the men Joshua had sent to spy on Jericho, and she lives in Israel to this day. And in Hebrews chapter 11, Rahab makes the list of heroes in the faith. Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after being encircled by the Israelites for 7 days. By faith, Rahab, the prostitute, received the spies in peace and didn't perish with those who disobeyed. By faith, Rahab, the prostitute Rahab, the one considered low in social standings. By faith, the one living in the comfort of different men's interactions. By faith, the one who everyone would have considered far away from God. By faith, of all the people in Jericho, Rahab the prostitute was not killed. Why? Because she was faithful. Because she was faithful when nobody else was. In seeing who the Lord was. In seeing what he had done for the Israelites. When nobody else was, she was faithful to God. When we look at these two women, what do they have in common? There's probably several things. And we could make a list for all afternoon. There are probably several things, but the main one that I see in this moment is both of these women had extraordinary trust and faith in God. And I'll submit to you this morning, what we can learn from these two, the faith of these two women caused them to have an extraordinary trust in God's plan for their lives. Beyond logic, beyond expectations, beyond preference, these two women exemplify trust in God because of their faith in God. And we see a patience taking place in their lives. We see a waiting on God's plan to play out in their own specific circumstances. Think about the life of Sarah. Think about how easy it would have been for her just to give up completely. And we see times in her life, right? We see times where she wavered. We see times in her life where she tried to control the situation. Like she gets this promise from God saying that she's going to, through her and Abraham, God is going to multiply and their name is going to become great. And yet you go years and years and decades without anything taking place in your life. And so what do? You take matters into your own hands. And she did this. She tried to control the situation and it ended up poorly. And you just continue on then at this point. And you think about her and you think about maybe you just get to the point to where you just don't think things are going to change. and that they are the way that they are, and nothing is going to get better. You're not going to have a son. Your name is not going to get expanded. And think about the life of Rahab. Think about the struggle for at least that short time between when she hid the spies and when the Israelites came and began marching around the city. Think about the struggle that was for her. Think about the risk that she took in lying to the officials of the city and sending them out of town on a chase that was following nobody. And when she did that, she could have just given up hope. In that time of waiting, she could have just given up hope that anything would come of it, that they were actually going to be saved. But she continued on. She continued on believing that God would be faithful and true to what he said through his people. And this is their story. This is their story of faith. And in a lot of ways, we are very similar. Because this is their story. This is our story. This is certainly my story. What we can do and what we say in our lives is this idea of, it's really easy to get to the place of saying, God, I surrender my life to you. And it's really easy to get to the place to where we say, God, I want to give you control of my life, and God, I want to give you the lead in my life, and you can write my story. There's lots of different ways that you can say that. You can write my story out. You can drive the car, whatever the case may be. It's really easy for us to get to the place of saying, yeah, God, I want you to lead my life. I want to follow your will in my life. And yet, when we say that, it's also really easy for us to kind of add some small print to that statement as well, isn't there? Like use this as an example. We get to a place in our lives and we say, God, I want to give you the pen of my life, and I want you to write my story. And I want to follow wherever you lead in my life. I want you to write out my story however you see fit. But what do we do in that moment? Like we're looking over the shoulder of God as things are getting written out, going, that ain't going to work. I don't want you to write that out. I don't agree with how you are writing out my story. And so what do? We try to take the pen back from time to time. We try to influence how the story is getting written. But here's the reality for us. If we are really going to give God the main seat in our lives, if we are really going to give him the pen to write out our stories for us and we follow him, if we are really going to do that, then we really need to do that. If we're really going to give him control, if we're really going to surrender our lives to him, then we need to surrender fully to him. And we need to have trust and patience like we see in the life of Sarah and in Rahab and what they had in their lives. I have struggled from time to time with arrogance. I know this is going to come as a shock to you, but I have a certain way that I kind of see things and operate, and if other things don't fit into that, I struggle sometimes with, working through that. I've struggled with other translations of the Bible. This is ultimately super petty. You're going to judge me. Just remember this is church. You can laugh at that too, please. You're like, oh, yes, absolutely. I've struggled with other translations of the Bible. Just coming out of college, I remember coming, and Roger used the New King James Version, I think only, if I remember right. And I didn't struggle with all of the New King James Version. I struggled with just pieces of the New King James Version that didn't necessarily to seem relevant for us anymore. And I remember hearing different passages being read out of the New King James, and the New King James would drop different words in that I just thought, man, that there's a better way of saying that. Like there's a better word to translate. And one of those passages is like Galatians chapter 5, and you know this passage probably pretty well. It's the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace. What is it? Patience is kind of the one that we all know, right? But and so if you look at this kind of at different translations, nearly all of the mainline translations use the word patience for that verse. Even the ESV that, is kind of hipster now that, the kids are using these days says patience in that moment. The NIV, nearly inspired version, uses forbearance. I'm just kidding. If you like NIV, it's fine. It uses forbearance. I don't necessarily understand off the top of my head what forbearance means, so that kind of muddies the water even more. But if you look at the New King James Version, it uses the word what? Do you know? Long-suffering. For years, I did not like that word. You laugh. I remember hearing this over and over again and having no appreciation for that word. And I thought patience was just a better word to use there. And ultimately, in my heart, I would discredit this because of that. But after 9 years of ministry, after 9 years of trying to give the pen of my life to God, to write out my story, after 9 years of trying to allow God to lead my life and me surrender to Him, more than any other time in my life do I have such a great respect and understanding of that word, long-suffering. If you ask Webster, Webster defines long-suffering as patiently enduring lasting offense or hardship. Patiently enduring lasting offense or hardship. And there are times, and there have been times in my life and in my marriage and in my family, in my ministry, in my parenting, where we have been challenged to practice long-suffering. And on the surface, patience and long-suffering may not seem like a giant struggle to us. But when you are in the midst of it, and when God is teaching you patience in your life, and I learned this from Roger, when God is teaching you patience, there's only one way to really learn patience, and that is to be put in the place to where you need to exercise patience. And when you're in the midst of that, it is sometimes a great struggle. When you're in the midst of it, it feels like at times it won't ever end. And maybe you're there. And maybe you have been there. Maybe you're there right now. For you, maybe it's a financial struggle. Maybe you're having to work longer and harder in order to make ends meet. Or maybe it's relational, and you're pressed down, and you're pressed down in your relationships. Your relationships are changing. Breakups, divorces, separations, deaths can cause hurt and struggle and pain in our lives. Or maybe it's in some sort of ministry environment when you're in the midst of struggle where it just seems like everything is against you, and you may feel like you're fighting for something that is a losing battle, and you're taking beatings on a weekly or even daily basis. Or maybe it's personal for you. Maybe you struggle to find where exactly your place or your purpose is in life. Maybe you're unsure about your future. Maybe you're unsure of what God is doing in your life. Maybe you don't understand the reasons why things are happening in your life that seem to be totally out of your control. It can be a number of different things for you. Most of you in here know what the last season of life has looked like for us, for me and my family. It is, for us right now, the definition of long-suffering. We've gone through now close to 2 or 2.5 years of loss after loss after loss in our lives. Grandparents, my father passed away in November. Just yesterday we lost a sister-in-law to a year-long battle with ovarian cancer. I can tell you that after 2 or 3 years, I began to understand and appreciate the relationship between trust in God's plan for your life and patience and long-suffering until that plan has worked itself out fully. And I began to understand and appreciate the importance and meaning of long-suffering. And you guys have heard me say this, like, I am not the perfect example of what this should look like in your life or in anybody's life. I'm not saying in any way that I've got this figured out well. The last 3 years or so of our lives have been really a beautiful example of enduring struggle and being patient and trusting God sometimes in the most wrong way possible. We have struggled greatly. We have fought and yelled and sometimes said some very Christian words. We've become angry at God and other believers. We've thrown our hands up in frustration and walked away. We've questioned God's plan often over the last 2 or 3 years. There have been times in the last couple years even in the last few months, where we've questioned why God is allowing any of this to happen in our lives. And yet, over this last season of life for us, this passage for me, this next passage has become more real and more true for us in this season. Romans chapter 8. Starting in verse 18, Paul says this. He says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is going to be revealed to us. For the creation eagerly waits with anticipation for God's sons to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, because of him who subjected it, in the hope that the creation itself will also be set free from the bondage of corruption into the glorious freedom of God's children. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together with labor pains until now. And not only that, but we ourselves who have the Spirit as the first fruits, we also groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. Now in this hope we are saved. Yet hope that is seen is not hope, because who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with patience. In the same way, the Spirit also joins to help in our weaknesses, because we do not know what to pray for as we should, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with unspoken groanings, and he who searches the hearts knows the Spirit's mindset, because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, those who are called according to his purpose. For those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brothers. And those he predestined, he also called, and those he called, he also justified, and those he justified, he also glorified. In the midst of a season of struggle, these words are some of the great truth that we hold on to. We may never fully understand why we go through seasons that push us into practicing patience and long-suffering. And you may never fully understand why the seasons of struggle happen in your life, but I can guarantee you this: if our eyes are set on God, these seasons are just a blink in comparison to what is coming on the other side of eternity. And through this, where we exercise patience and we exercise long-suffering, that is where we find our hope. We cannot promise that the season will end, but we can promise that on the other side of eternity is a life so much greater with our Creator and with our Lord. And so that's what we hold on to. And that's what we look forward to. Church, be encouraged in the midst of seasons of struggle, in the midst of seasons of pain, in the midst of seasons where our faith is being put to the test. Be encouraged that this is just a short season in our lives. And look forward to an eternity with God on the other side of that. Let's pray. God, I'm so thankful for this time, and thankful for your word. I'm thankful for Sarah and for Rahab, that we get to look back on their lives and learn and hear your truth and your words speak into sometimes very difficult parts of our lives. And Father, I pray for us for sure that several, if not most of us, are in the midst of some form of season of difficulty, of struggle, of pain in our lives, and it can seem overwhelming in the time, and yet, God, I pray that these words from Romans 8 would remain in the front of our mind at all times, that this time, this season of pain is just in a moment, and that we're being called to something greater and better on the other side of eternity. And so, Father, help us to put our hope in that and ultimately put our hope and that promise in you. Father, give us patience. Give us long suffering at times. Give us the desire to keep fighting the fight, to keep pushing forward in the midst of pain and struggle, following after you, looking forward to the day that's coming when we get to be with you. We love you. We thank you for Jesus. We thank you for what he did for us on the cross. We love you. It's in your Son Jesus' name. Amen.